Peru, Vermont. It's a pretty laid back, low-key, quiet town that not much happens in. Oh, it's a big thing when a baby's born, and it's still a big thing when, you know, when anything happens here. The same events happen from year to year. It was pretty alarming for a lot of people to, you know, pick up USA Today and see Peru, Vermont, you know, man breeding rats.
Normally the selectmen are involved with, you know, the snowplow mocked over the nail box, and maybe there's some dog problems, a barking dog, or a dog killed a chicken or something like that. But last fall, rumors started going around town that he had some rats up there that he was feeding. And at that time, they appeared to be in cages. The neighbors were upset and they came to the board, and we checked with the State Board of Health, and there were no regulations that said a fellow couldn't feed rats in cages.
Up until, you know, everything came to a head this summer, it really seemed more like it was, you know, Roland's raising rats. And at one point my husband came home from the fire department meeting saying that, well, the rats were escaping. and you know, then not too much longer we started having problems here.
People began to see rats on his premises when they went by, and you could see there were numerous holes in the ground where they burrowed and so forth. You could hear, if you stood on the road, you could hear the rats in his house chewing away at things and running around and so forth.
They totally invaded my vegetable garden. I have raised beds, and they made tunnels through the garden, and they ate, you know, little bites out of all the beets and all the carrots, and, you know, really ruined the whole harvest.
We've had a few rats around, mostly dead. We have 2 dogs and 2 cats that are fairly aggressive about that kind of stuff. We've had, you know, rat droppings on the porch and stuff, but they've never been inside.
In our pantry, they had ripped out all of the insulation in one wall of the outside wall in the pantry, and it was underneath all the canned stuff. It was, I guess they really like insulation, so they really went after that. I think they use it in making their nests. And they ate Fig Newtons. They liked the Fig Newtons, and crackers, things that were open, some potatoes that were open and in a bin. And I think that's all they, and the cat food. I think that the cat food was very similar to what Roland was feeding them. He was feeding them dog food, I believe.
When he's not home, they're all pretty much hiding. You'd see 3 or 4 of them run around, just scooting back and forth. When he's feeding them, sometimes you go by and he's feeding them and you see a lot of them running, but you don't really get a sense. I mean, you see maybe, at the most I ever saw was maybe 50 at a time. So you know there's a lot of rats if you can see 50, but you don't really. So he said, do you want to come see the rats? I said, sure. You know, I'd at that point gotten to talk to him quite a bit and felt pretty safe around him. And I was pretty much overwhelmed. It was a lot of rats. I mean, if there was less than 1,000, I'd be surprised in a very small area. And I just said, you know, I'd look at his house. He showed me inside his house, and I said, you know, if the people in Waterbury, or the people that are overseeing him at his case, so to speak, whatever, could see how he's living. I mean, you read in the paper, there's this guy feeding rats. You know, he lives in a shack, he feeds rats. If they could see what it looks like underneath his house, where the rats climbing up and down, and they could see all the insulation pulled out and the piles of rat shit all over the place. If they could smell it, but I mean, if they could just see this, it would be, it would touch them somehow. They would be able to feel they should do something about it. It may make a difference. So the next day, I ran out and borrowed somebody's video camera, which I've never held a video camera. And if you see the film, you'll see that I never held a video camera. And he comes into town every day, and he came in front of my shop, and I said, you know, thanks for showing me the rats. Yesterday, I thought that was pretty interesting, and he talked about it for a while. I said, would you mind if I came up and videotaped this? And he said, sure, come up anytime. You know, what time do you want to come up, and whatever. And so I ended up giving him a ride back with this big piles of food, and I videotaped it.
I'm going to give them some, I give them some water sometimes. It's just so problematical. I'd have to go down to the bottom of the hill and cart up with that thing.
Yeah. And, you know, he'd put the food out, and he'd whistle for them, and, you know, 5 or 10 minutes would go by, and you'd see one every once in a while scurry around underneath his old car and piles of stuff. And they'd eventually come out, and then after about a half hour, there'd be rats all over the place.
Can I take a look at what you're making here?
Ross and Les?
No, thanks. I had lunch a little while ago.
Wasn't the drink.
No, I'm okay, thanks.
I couldn't afford them really. I spent $20 a day. I think, let's see, 5, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Well, between $15 and $20 a day on food, and couldn't really afford it, so.
And what were you feeding them?
Oh, I had 2 bags of dog food, which cost $5 a piece almost, and 2 loaves of bread, and 2 bags of popcorn, and 2 things of Coke. I have a water problem, so I have to go down to the brook to get water or get rainwater, and the rain was very poor this summer. When I was here, I didn't get enough to give them water much, so I gave them Coke all the time. So I couldn't really enough afford them, and I decided, I mean, I spent my last dime, and then decided I was just going to go away if people were not really coming around with some other larger kind of legal problems. And I thought people in this community who admittedly owe me some money and favors would do that, but they didn't. They chose to be sort of imperious and, I say, rude in the final analysis. All the pretense of Queens High and you ought to get married, and boy, we got you fucked at that point, which I think is really what they're mostly about. Most people who are have adulterous marriages are quite, frankly, I think after telling the final analysis, they'd rather everyone did since there's less trouble. But I don't know if that's true or not.
I suppose, when did you first meet Roland Williams?
I've known him for a long time, for about the last 19, 20 years.
As a patient or?
First, actually, as a musician. He used to play the piano in a restaurant, and he used to be the organist at the Peru church, where I was a member of the choir and then the conductor of the choir, so I knew him musically before I knew him as a patient. At this point, even with medicine, Andrew or Roland would not be a very creative person because of the effects of the schizophrenia over many years. But earlier, when he was taking medicine, he was as normal as you or I. In fact, he was very much better than you or I, because he is a very gifted pianist and organist, outstandingly so. But he has elected not to take medicine, as many schizophrenics do, and unfortunately that leads to the deterioration of their faculties over a period of years.